counties, and not much information beyond that. I talked about how the audit data were to be used. The mandate also...
Bill, I'm sorry, you want to export your slide this week.
Oh, sorry, yeah. There we go. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, okay, thank you. So there was some limited specification to how the sample was to be drawn. There was relatively little said about how the results were to be used. The mandate also required that a statistician be commissioned to provide help with sample selection. I was that statistician. I mostly study obesity and low back pain. I've been a kind of a political junkie for most of my life, so it was an interesting thing to do. The legislation called for in each of the selected precincts to conduct a manual, they call a hand-eye count. There were 2 elections in last year, a May primary and a November general election. The legislation also required that the auditing be done of offices that were statewide, and that would include state-level offices as well as national, as the case may be. A little more background on the sampling. North Carolina has about 3,000 precincts, 100 counties, as I mentioned. In the May primary, we selected 200, 2 per county. And you'll notice it was 264, a little higher in the November election, and that was a result of a point that we felt that increased sample the second time around should go where a discrepancy had been found. So more discrepancy, larger sample. And that's sort of been a principle that we've heard in other sessions. The process, we've heard plenty about how these manual counts are done. I'm sure there are idiosyncratic features for North Carolina, but it was, as I'm told, the standard way for doing manual vote counting. So the sample was drawn, the audit data, the recount was done, and suddenly appeared on my doorstep was a data set with the results in both instances without much information given to me as to what I should do with it. And so my natural instinct was to look at what information was available and say, well, what interesting things might we find? Well, it turned out that we focused on 2 types of discrepancy, what we call a discrepancy in candidate count, you'll see that as DCC, and then a discrepancy in total count. And in effect, just sort of to give you a visual sense, what this means is that if we have an election here and there are 4 candidates, E1 through 4, with a total count for all votes cast for those 4 candidates, for the recounts we would have comparable candidate counts and the total. And so when I'm talking about the discrepancy in total counts, I'm saying looking at the total count from the election versus the recount. And when I'm talking about all discrepancies at the candidate level, I'm looking at all of these comparatives, candidate by candidate. So we did a little analysis with those 2 discrepancy measures. And what I'm going to show you in this table, I actually have multiple tables. I'm just going to show one for an interest of time. But we felt it would be interesting to try to project for the 3,000 counties from this sample of a couple of hundred what the discrepancy profile looked like for the state. And we decided beyond that, since we determined that the information we had for each precinct included information on what type of voting machine that was used. And there are 2 primary voting machines used in North Carolina, the so-called M100 machines and Ivotronic machines. So we thought, well, let's look at the pattern of discrepancy, and then let's also compare it by the type of voting machine to see if there are some differences. Now, let me explain this table. Across the x-axis here, we're looking at discrepancies. It's a little hard to see, but this is going from a -4 to a +4, and then the highlighted in the middle here, 0, says that there was agreement. And what we're looking at is the total count discrepancy here. So what this finding would say is that based upon the sample, we estimate that about 83% of the precincts in North Carolina would have complete agreement on the total vote count. And 10.5% would have a discrepancy of a -1. -1 on the minus sign means that you have an undercount, and a plus means you have an overcount, according to the way that we define discrepancy. So what did we learn from this? And I've got a little slide that summarizes the findings, but in addition to looking at this profile, what we saw, for example, is that if you look at the percentages on the left side here, the minus is the undercount side, you see that the percentages are a little bit larger than on the right side. So that says that there was sort of a net tendency for undercount on total vote count discrepancies. Another thing that you note in looking at the type of machines is that the discrepancies were somewhat more diverse and generally larger in size for the M100 machines than they were for the Ivotronic. So there was a sense of sort of doing a comparative on the type of machine. That gives you some idea of what we tried to do with it, but with no particular set of instructions as to how we were to do this. That's my main point. So I want to jump now to lessons learned and spend my last minute or so talking about some of the things we learned. First of all, the mandate requires random selection. It's certainly important, but it needs to be strategically planned random selection. And in particular, and this is the point I made from the floor earlier, is that we need to have some sense as what we're trying to really learn from the audit. And I guess my specific point would be that the legislation should be explicit on that point. And ours is not currently. Dropping the county focus, I didn't quite understand why we needed to sample each county if we're trying to get a statewide representation. The other point I illustrated, we want to sample more intensively where we find evidence of discrepancy the next time that we do it, so we sort of learn going from one time to the other. Another point is that the sample locations we felt should not be announced until after the elections, and indeed, this process called for sample selection to be done separate from the people who did the auditing, and that's sort of standard procedure in doing surveys. Finally, on data gathering, we felt that recounting should be blinded to the election count. In other words, when the counting is done, if that's possible, we should know what the count was. And it's perhaps some thought given to the method of doing manual to make it an even closer to gold standard. And the point is that in any process, whether it's doing the election or doing the audit, expect some glitches. I'll stop there.